The Fugitive Slave Act, 1850 USA. Imagine you're playing a huge game of tag where one side doesn't want to play, but is forced into the game. They have to run for their lives while you do the chasing. That's essentially what the Fugitive Slave Act of the USA is. During the 1800s, the northern and southern territories of America weren't exactly the best of friends. The South, composed of farming states, relied on slaves to do the dirty work. Meanwhile, the North was progressing to a more industrial era, where slavery was yesterday's fashion, and factories were now the latest trend. This law was supposed to ease tensions between the two territories because the North could make the South happy by bringing back any of their escaped slaves. According to this law, if a slave escaped and made a beeline to the North, everyone in the North had to help catch them and send them back to their owner in the South like it was a classroom project. Even Northerners who weren't fans of slavery found themselves in a sticky situation because if they didn't lend a hand in catching escapees, they could end up paying fines, or worse, getting a tour of the local jail. It was like being forced into a role of reluctant bounty hunters, searching their own neighborhoods for fugitives. Then there was the most controversial part of the law, which cashed in on the idea of justice. It created special courts that decided whether or not you were a slave. The twist was that the judge's paycheck got a little fatter every time they declared someone a slave. So even if you had worked decades to buy your freedom fair and square, a money-hungry judge could just hit the reset button on your life. Plus, you couldn't speak up for yourself or have a normal trial. But instead of improving relations between the two territories, the law led to certain Northerners doing their best superhero impressions by helping slaves escape to Canada. This increasing tensions helped set the stage for the Civil War, a battle between the North and the South where slavery was the championship belt that was on the line. The Nuremberg Laws, 1935 Germany. You're back in the middle of the 1930s in Germany, where Adolf Hitler and his weird mustache were still in charge of the country. He and the Nazi Party were like playing a video game where their main quest was to get rid of all the Jews, a people they hated and deemed inferior. That was when they enacted the Nuremberg Laws. These laws were a set of rules Jews and Germans were forced to follow. The first rule was that Jewish people couldn't marry or even date non-Jewish Germans, telling Cupid to be more mindful with his love arrow. So if you have a crush on that Jewish girl in class, you might want to find someone else to fancy. It also said Jewish people couldn't hire young German women to work in their homes. Basically, it was like the government is telling you to stay in a lane paved with discrimination. Now imagine being benched from an important basketball game, not because you're not good, but only because the coach doesn't like you. That's similar to how this law treated Jews, who weren't considered full citizens. Only the Nazis got the final say on who were true Germans, and the Jews weren't on the list. Being a full citizen is a big deal because it lets you vote, have certain jobs, and do other important things. Jewish people lost all these rights, which is like being told you can't play in a game everyone else is playing. On top of that, the Nazis took things further by deciding who was Jewish based on family trees rather than personal beliefs. So even if you didn't practice the religion, having Jewish grandparents could still mean losing your rights. Prohibition, 1920 to 1933, USA. The Prohibition period in the United States is history saying you cannot separate a man from alcohol. Uncle Sam was trying to take away one of humanity's greatest pastimes, which is getting wasted and leaving a bar with good memories, or no memories at all. This period, which lasted from 1920 to 1933, basically posted an off-limits sign for Johnny Walker, Jack Daniel, Jose Cuervo, and all those names your uncle hangs out with during the weekend. That's because the government thought that booze was the root of all the country's troubles. But these laws backfired on them. When alcohol went away legally, it didn't disappear from people's wish lists. Instead, secret bars called speakeasies started popping up everywhere. You could find them hidden under buildings, behind sneaky doors, or maybe a trap door under your couch. Everyone who wanted a drink knew where to find one, even if it was a bit hush-hush. Now, who was going to get the alcohol to these secret spots? That's where the bootleggers and gangsters came into the picture. So instead of baking pies and cookies, people were brewing alcohol in their kitchens, or finding ways to sneak that stuff illegally. One example of these people was the famous gangster named Al Capone. He made a fortune during Prohibition by controlling the alcohol black market. If people wanted to get drunk, they had Capone on speed dial. Crime actually went up during Prohibition because gangsters were always trying to outsmart the police and keep their illegal drinks flowing. It was like a big slap to the face of the government, and the more the authorities pushed, the more people got drunk in secret. Finally, after 13 years, the government realized their plan might have been a mistake. In 1933, they decided to allow alcohol again with the 21st Amendment, but the government also started making making money by taxing alcohol, which turned out to be a win-win situation for both the booze lovers and the government. The Patriot Act, 2001 USA. It was 2001, and people were still paranoid about the events surrounding the 9/11 attacks. Anyone, from that friendly neighbor to that dog on the street, could be a terrorist in disguise. That's why the government came up with the Patriot Act to keep worrywarts relaxed. This law was like giving the government super spy glasses that allowed them to peek into people's phone calls and emails. They could tell who you were chatting with, even if you were only there to flirt with your school crush. But the privacy issues involved with this law convinced many people that this wasn't the coolest way to keep them safe. They felt that the government was nosy, like a neighbor who peeks over the fence and won't mind their beeswax. People were also worried that these spy powers might not just be used against the bad guys, but could snoop on regular people. Eventually, this whole thing turned into a never-ending debate. In one corner were people who thought these powers were important to prevent a sequel of 9/11 from happening again. The other corner had people who wanted to keep the government from keeping tabs on everyone. While the Patriot Act eventually expired, some of its rules got carried over to the USA Freedom Act, which is kind of like a less nosy version of this law. Think of it as a Pokemon evolving into a better version of itself. Apartheid laws, 1948 to 1994, South Africa. If a law literally means apartness, you know it isn't a good idea. That was the gist of the apartheid laws, which kept people of different races apart. It was like being at a school dance and being told you can only stand in certain corners of the dance floor based on your shoe color. These rules said that white people and black people, along with others, couldn't mix in places like schools, buses, or even neighborhoods. Imagine going to a pizza party where everyone can't choose their toppings, and some only get plain bread, while others get extra cheese and pepperoni. That was how tough life was for people of color in South Africa. The leaders back then, who were mostly white, made these laws to ensure they kept the best jobs, schools, and neighborhoods for themselves, as if they were hogging all the video games and letting others only watch. Because of this law, non-white South Africans had to live in shady areas and needed special passes to visit the nicer spots where white people lived. Even something such as falling in love with someone from a different race was a bad idea. And if you broke any of their rules, you'd be in a bad situation. That's essentially the adult version of getting detention in school. Eventually, people got tired of these rules. This led to protests where people of color fought for fairness. Things eventually changed, and apartheid ended in 1994. And in the biggest, in-your-face moment to apartheid, Nelson Mandela was elected as the first black South African president. The Stamp Act, 1765, British America. It may sound like a law supporting your growing stamp collection, but this wasn't the kind of hobby Americans and other British colonies enjoyed during the middle of the 1700s. Instead, the Stamp Act required almost everything from newspapers, legal documents, and playing cards to have stamps on them, or else they're illegal, and you had to pay extra for that tiny stamp. Now, the reason why the British government did this was because they needed some extra cash. Think of it as their side hustle. But imagine being told by your landlord he's increasing your rent to fund his new security system. That's what the Stamp Act felt like. The British government needed more money to pay their soldiers in the colonies, and they thought putting an extra $1 or $2 on newspapers would help them with their finances. Of course, Americans weren't happy about this extra fee. Back then, paper was very important because people had nothing to do but read newspapers, books, and anything written on paper. If they didn't have paper, they'd be staring at walls all day. So being told that their paper was illegal unless they paid for stamps was like being told you can't watch a movie unless you pay an extra fee on top of the ticket you already paid for. You'd have nothing left for popcorn. This led to organized rallies and angry mobs that chased away stamp sellers and brought British businesses down, throwing the British government's financial situation into chaos. So in 1766, the British waved the white flag and struck down the law after 1 year after realizing people would rather die of boredom than buy newspapers and playing cards with stamps on them. Corn laws, 1815 to 1846, UK. Let's say you're in a school cafeteria where school officials own every food stall and where food is twice as expensive as that next door fast food joint. You'd be running out of money at recess. By lunchtime, you'd be starving. That's what the corn laws were like, as the UK enacted these laws to decide who can sell corn and other grain products in the country. These laws aimed to allow British farmers to sell their grain without worrying about cheaper corn coming from other countries. Imagine the difficulty of selling your lemonade while your neighbor sells theirs at half price. That was the problem British farmers faced, and why the corn laws benefited them. Farmers and landowners were pretty happy because they made good money from these laws. You'd be happy too if no one else was there to mess up your lemonade business at school, but the city people weren't exactly thrilled because that meant they had to pay more for food. Imagine being told you need to pay for the more expensive brand of cornflakes when you barely have any money for rent. There's also the fact that when food prices skyrocket, other prices also become more expensive. This led to people getting upset about not wanting to spend so much on food. Even business owners and workers joined the rumble because they wanted to pay for grain that didn't drill holes in their wallets. Finally, after a lot of arguing and protesting, the government decided to end these laws in 1846. This made food cheaper and helped everyone because they didn't have to pay an arm and a leg for their next meal. Alien and Sedition Acts, 1798 USA. This isn't a law against interstellar visitors who claim they come in peace. Instead, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 were like the government telling non-Americans they didn't trust them and were making some tough rules for them. These were 4 laws passed when people were worried about spies and troublemakers, especially with France acting all suspicious. The first laws were the Alien Friends and Alien Enemies Acts, which said the president could kick out or lock up foreigners who seemed dangerous. If people thought you were shady, you'd get shipped back to your home country first thing in the morning. Then came the Naturalization Act. This one told immigrants they needed to live in the US for 14 years before they could become citizens. That's basically your entire childhood up to your puberty years. It was the government's way of making it hard for new people to vote or have a say. But the Sedition Act was the loudest and most unpopular of the laws. If you said the president has funny hair, you'd get grounded and punished because this law made it illegal to say bad stuff about the government, the president, or Congress. The unfair nature of these laws got people mad, even if they weren't immigrants. They thought the government was acting like a bossy big brother, taking away rights like free speech, and treating immigrants like they didn't belong. This was President John Adams' worst move, because these laws caused his popularity to dip worse than a prom queen with acne. So when it was time for a new president, people quickly changed sides, as they chose Thomas Jefferson, who wasn't a big fan of these laws. Racial Integrity Act, 1924, USA. Imagine someone telling you you could only eat vanilla ice cream forever because they thought it was the best flavor. That sounds pretty silly, and it's similar to what happened when Virginia passed the Racial Integrity Act in 1924. Historically, Virginia wasn't known for being the friendliest state to black people, especially with the entire slavery fiasco hundreds of years ago. That's why the government enacted this law as a way of keeping track of people's races and making sure that white people could only marry other white people. During that time, the law used something called the one-drop rule. If someone had any African ancestry, even just a tiny bit, they were labeled as colored. It's like saying that if you add a sprinkle of pepper to a huge soup pot, the whole thing is spicy. Another problem with this law was that the authorities had a say on who was black or white. So if you had a bad day of sunbathing, there's a good chance these guys would tell you you're not white. The Racial Integrity Act stuck around until 1967, destroying interracial love stories for decades. It only ended when Richard and Mildred Loving fought against the law because they wanted to be married but were from different races. Their fight went all the way to the big bosses at the Supreme Court, which decided that love won and that there was no room for this unfair law against romance. The Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882, USA. It's the late 1800s, and you're a Chinese worker who crossed the ocean to live the American dream. But as soon as you get to American shores, you must take the first boat back to China because you can't work in the USA. It's like there's a huge "No Chinese Allowed" sign on the US border because of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This happened during the gold rush when many Chinese people entered the USA to find work. They weren't there to turn the country into a Chinese colony, but just wanted to come to America to work hard, build railroads, and dig for gold. As more Chinese workers arrived, Americans wondered if there were enough jobs to go around for everyone else. Picture it like a big job pie. Americans were fine slicing it up amongst themselves, but didn't want to share any with the Chinese, as if they'd eaten too many slices of pie already. Instead of offering an extra fork, they essentially told the Chinese to take their appetites elsewhere, and the government supported their own through this law, which decided that no more Chinese workers could come to America. Even if you were already there before the law was enacted, that didn't mean you were in the clear. The law said you couldn't become a citizen, even if you spent decades in America. And just to sprinkle salt in the wound, if you wanted to pop back to China for a quick visit to honor your ancestors, you couldn't return. The law effectively turned a vacation into a one-way trip. Initially, the law was supposed to last for only 10 years, but kept getting renewed, which was bad news for anyone who loved eating Chinese takeout. It lasted over 6 decades until it was finally repealed in 1943, allowing more Chinese people to move to America without worrying about the consequences. consequences. Jim Crow laws, late 19th century to 1965 USA. The Jim Crow laws were essentially a huge chess set where the black pieces were on one side while the white pieces were on the other, because it made black people and white people live separately. That was just the beginning. The laws also said that black and white people couldn't use the same schools, restaurants, or bathrooms, or even drink from the same water fountains. The idea was supposed to be separate but equal, but calling it equal was like saying a paper airplane is just as good as a private jet. The places and stuff black people could use were usually way worse than what white people had. Think of it like this: if everyone in school had to play a game, but one team got broken toys and the other team got shiny new ones, that would be unfair. Well, that's how these laws worked. But these rules didn't just come out like an RKO out of nowhere. They started after the Civil War, when black people were freed from slavery and gained some power in society. Some white people in the South didn't like this change, and made Jim Crow laws to stay in charge and keep things from changing. These laws were the slavery sequel no one asked for. Not wanting to live in an oppressive society, people fought hard to get rid of these laws. Names like Martin Luther King Jr. spearheaded the protests, until the laws were changed in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Now the only place you should never mix blacks with whites is the washing machine. The Homestead Act, 1862 USA. The government acted like Oprah Winfrey during the height of the Homestead Act in 1862. They were like, "You get a farm, you get a farm, everyone gets a farm." The government was handing out farm cards like free samples in a grocery store. They even said you could own up to 160 acres of land. But there was a catch. You had to live on this land, farm it, and turn it into a productive agricultural haven within 5 years. If you could do that, the land was yours. It was a huge farm simulator video game brought to life. Of course, people from all over, even from other countries, thought that getting free real estate was a good deal. This led many people packing their stuff from the big city to move to places like Nebraska and Oklahoma to try their luck at farming. But they found out the hard way that farming wasn't as easy as planting a few seeds and waiting for them to grow while you sit and do the crossword puzzles in the morning newspaper. What made things worse was that most of these people were farming on unforgiving land. Imagine planting veggies in a sandbox, but with more wind and less water. It also didn't help that Native American people were already living on those lands for thousands of years and were playing tug of war with the new settlers for their land. This led to failed farms and occasional arrow and bullet exchanges with the native tribes. The Homestead Act may have had a good idea, but the execution and information campaign were poor. Despite having its fair share of problems, this law was a big part of how the West got filled up with towns and farms. So you better thank the Homestead Act for those potato fries you love eating daily.